South Carolina gets another test. They failed the first one miserably. They've got a big one coming up, of course, against Eastern Division rival Georgia. We go to the source here, Chris Phillips, the Spurs Up Show. We always enjoy the conversation with Chris. Chris, what is going on today?
Mark, appreciate you having me on, man. It's always a pleasure to talk ball with you. And just getting ready for SEC play, right, to finally get underway. For South Carolina, they had that opening season test, and they failed like many SEC teams have failed to this point. You and I were just talking off the air. SEC has lost 6 games against Power 5 competition to this point. All 6 have been by double digits. So, as all these teams have question marks and things to figure out, I think we're going to start to learn a lot more about these football teams as we get into SEC play. So really exciting. The Carolina-Georgia series. It's one that's special to me. I grew up in the CSRA, which is the Augusta, North Augusta, Aiken type of area right on the border of South Carolina and Georgia. So a lot of fond memories growing up around Georgia fans and some of those great games over the years. But certainly this is a stiff test for Shane Beamer's football team, a team that certainly has no lack of questions they'll look to answer between the hedges.
Chris, what we learned in week 1 is something I did not expect to learn. And you know that because we talked about that North Carolina matchup a number of times throughout the offseason. If somebody would have said North Carolina is going to win this game, I would have not been surprised at all, even though I picked South Carolina to win. But if they would have told me that North Carolina was going to throw South Carolina around like they did at the line of scrimmage, we have not seen that out of the powder blue in forever against a decent opponent. So we won't dissect it from the North Carolina side, but 9 sacks, 16 tackles for loss against that South Carolina offense held them to basically 0 on the ground. You take the sacks away, of course, it's a skewed stat, but still just dominance up front. That's what surprised me.
Yeah, Mark, it was all of our worst nightmares came to fruition. Like you and I talked before, and that was something I hammered down in the preseason, was that South Carolina's offensive line was a major question mark, right? You were returning 50 less starts than you had from a season ago when you lost Jovan Gwynn, Eric Douglas, and Dylan Wanham. You replaced those players. You replaced that production with FCS caliber talent, call it for what it is. And South Carolina and Shane Beamer, they've done a great job in his first 2 years identifying guys from these lower level schools, right? Jalen Brooks, Juice Wells, Carlins Platel, other players, if you will, and getting the most out of them. But Mark, you know as well as I do, it's different on the line of scrimmage, right? Especially on the offensive line. And there's a reason, when you see these teams play each other, like when you see a South Carolina play a Furman, for example, you see a Georgia play a Ball State, whatever the score is, the biggest discrepancy of talent is in the trenches. And I think that's what you've seen, right? They thought they plugged some holes with guys like Sidney Fugar and Jackson Hughes and Nee Manziel and, Nick Gargiulo, who's been really good in the interior, by the way. But it's just been a very much so makeshift work in progress. And, that's what you saw on opening night. I don't think anybody could have seen that coming, right? 9 sacks in that football game. Like you mentioned, 16 tackles for loss. And, I'll take you this, Mark, while the pass protection was much better against Furman in the game that just took place over the weekend, Gamecocks got that big bounce back victory they needed, 47-21. The rushing attack was still just completely absent, wasn't a factor. 2.8 yards per carry against the Furman Paladins defensive front. So, Mark, I think you look at this football team right now and, it's not the sexiest thing or most fun thing to talk about, but it's line of scrimmage for South Carolina because right now, Mark, Spencer Rattler's playing as well as any quarterback in the SEC. Xavier Legette has emerged as a top target, not just in the SEC, but all of college football. He leads all of Power 5 in receiving yards. They get Juice Wells back healthy because he hasn't been at 100%. All of a sudden, you've got a great 1-2 punch there. They've got the skill position players, Mark, to really make some noise. But as you and I both know, it all starts up front. It all starts in the trenches. That's been a problem on the defensive side as well, generating 0 sacks in that first game against Drake May and UNC. And then, against Furman, they had 3 sacks in that ball game, but still you can see the problems there also. So it really is trench warfare. And Mark, that's where the questions lie for South Carolina as they take on one of the best offensive and defensive fronts in college football on Saturday against the Georgia Bulldogs.
When these two teams get together, Georgia's typically won by at least 2 scores, except for that 1-3 interception day from Jake Fromm, kind of a fluky win in 20, was that 18, 19?
That was 19, I believe. Actually, that's the last time Georgia's been defeated at the Sanford Stadium. I think that streak's now at 20 games right now. So that loss you're speaking of, that's the last time we've seen Georgia beaten.
That would make sense. Yeah, the Bulldogs missed a field goal late in that one. All right. Talk about the first couple games. Not a whole lot to go on,
No, not
although I
really.
will say that maybe what's been the best offensive line in the country, there's been some talk out there that maybe not performing up to its standards so far.
And I think there's some. That's fair to say. I mean, even Tate Routledge. We spoke to him earlier this week. Mentioned the fact they have not been quite as physical as they need to be. I know. Both. UT Martin and Ball State showed some off balance, odd looks on defense with the defensive line. But as Tate said, that's no excuse. When you're Georgia, you should be able to move guys out of the way pretty easily, no matter what your opponent is lined up, especially in these non-conference games. So that's an area I know they want to try to get better at this week, and they'll need to once Georgia, starts SEC play on Saturday against South Carolina.
Folks, we've got an SEC channel we just launched. You can see it down there on the ticker. So just follow that over. And we've got Georgia coverage as well as everybody else in the SEC for the best in the Bulldogs and South Carolina previews. Join Anthony there at ugasports.com. 73 pass attempts the first two games against 58 runs. And for two games that obviously turned out to be big blowouts, when you're running the ball heavily in the fourth quarter, I think that ratio speaks even louder considering they've not been competitive games. Is that a intended philosophy to be that pass heavy?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, Coach Mark talked a lot in the preseason about you're not going to see much difference in what Mike Bobo does this year is what we saw from Todd Monk in the previous, three. I mean, the Georgia's, strengths are at skill position players, especially, at wide out with receivers, like Dominic Lovett. Of course, Ladd McConkey's not been able to play yet, but once he gets back, he'll be a major cog. And of course, Brock Bowers. I mean, you want to get the ball to these guys as much as possible. So no, I'm not really, surprised at that ratio. I think the biggest surprise folks may have is for everyone who's been complaining about Georgia's run game, is actually almost identical to what it was last year against Oregon and Sanford. Now, granted, Georgia not played anybody to the caliber of Oregon, but Georgia rushed for less yards last year against Sanford than they did against the Ducks in the season opener. I think it's like, just like 1 yard difference in rushing yards, only one attempt difference from last year. So from that standpoint, I think that's a number that maybe surprises a lot of people. But as far as what they're trying to do with the passing game, that's no surprise. They're trying to get the ball in the air to their skill players as much as they can.
Well, the expectations and the standard,
they're huge. They're there.
yeah, they turn out to be kind of high when you never lose a game.
Yeah,
when it's
no
been
doubt.
forever.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and again, in Oregon against Oregon last year, they played. That was about as perfect a first game I'd ever seen a Bulldog team play. And these last last two games, they start off kind of clunky offensively in both of those contests, and people want to know why and that kind of thing. But that's a rare deal, though. You see a team play like they did in the first contest last year. That usually doesn't happen right out of the gate.
Anthony, when is McConkey projected to be back, and are there any other injuries to look out for?
Not really sure. I mean, Coach Smart actually, told us yesterday. It's just one of those nagging little. Anybody who's ever had a back problem, a back issue, knows those things can be kind of tricky to come back from. Now he is running, doing that kind of thing, but he's not been cleared for contact yet. They're just trying to be 100% sure that he's able to go. He's trying, and they're doing everything they can to get him back as quickly as possible. But right now, it's just a little bit of a problem where he'll be taking a chance if he's out there, on the field. As far as other injuries go, they are getting some players back. They did get freshman linebacker Raylan Wilson, who they expect to play a big role, next season. They hope to get, backup offensive lineman Austin Blasky back for this one, although I'm not too sure if that's going to happen. Coach Smart claimed he might be available. But, Devon Bullard, he's iffy, I think, for the game. Injured his ankle early in the contest against Ball State. I doubt he's going to play this weekend, but we'll see. He's a tough guy. I wouldn't put anything past him. But those are the major injuries right now that Georgia's looking at.
South Carolina, of course, shook things up in the SEC last year when they demolished Tennessee and then followed that up with a win against Clemson. They almost beat Notre Dame in the Gator Bowl. It appears overall to be a program that's on the rise. Shane Beamer's impressing a lot of people, but maybe this particular team has a lot of issues to work through. A North Carolina defense that hasn't been considered a physical, tough, stingy defense for a long time, racked up 16 tackles for loss. You hardly ever see a number like that, and 9 sacks on Spencer Rattler, who otherwise seems to be throwing the ball well. But my goodness, if he's running for his life, that's not going to be a good formula for winning.
No doubt. I mean, the 9 sacks you mentioned, that's a huge concern for South Carolina. I mean, young offensive line, some guys that are playing for the first time, and you're matched up against the Georgia defense. That could be good news for Georgia. We'll see. But Spencer Rattler, when he has had time, I just based on his stats, I think he's playing better than he was, last year, already completing 83% of his passes. He's got a lot of good receivers. Some of those guys, fans may not really know yet, but big, physical, fast, and they know what to do when they get the ball in their hands. So Spencer Rattler, obviously the key for both teams in this one. I mean, for South Carolina to have any kind of a chance, he's got to be, spot on. And for Georgia, finding a way to contain him is going to be the key, because so far, anyway, South Carolina's running game has been pretty non-existent so far.
Xavier Legette in particular with about 300 yards receiving in those first 2 games for South Carolina.
And Mark, money is coming on the Georgia Bulldogs early. I think it actually opened at 25.5, and last time I checked, it was at 27.5. So people are expecting Georgia to cover. And, listen, I partly don't blame them, Mark, because, as I mentioned before, this is a special game for me because growing up where I grew up, Carolina, Georgia, it felt like a great rivalry. You could always count on, right, Mark, the games being close, being competitive. Of course, South Carolina had that great run of success from 2010 to 14 when Steve Spurrier was there against Georgia. But since then, Mark, I mean, it's been ugly. Since 2015, only 1 game in this series has been decided by single digits, and that was South Carolina's win in 2019. Every other game has been a double-digit loss for the Gamecocks against the Dogs, including the 41-point loss last year. I mean, it was a complete bloodbath at Williams-Brice Stadium a season ago. So I agree with you, Mark, for the recipe for success, the recipe for the massive upset yet again. I think they've got to put this game on Carson Beck's right shoulder, right, and make him throw the football, make him uncomfortable. But again, you do that, and Georgia's got a fantastic array of weapons. They still have Brock Bowers. But I think for South Carolina to have any chance, Mark, they've got to slow down or even stop the running game. Offensively, it's going to take a masterful performance from Spencer Rattler. I don't expect all of a sudden this is the week the running game gets going for South Carolina. I'm not exactly sure, Mark, how they're going to protect him and give him a lot of time to throw. I don't think they give up 9 sacks again, right? But this defensive front is vastly superior to what UNC featured in game 1. I think it's going to take a great game plan from Dowell Loggins, Shane Beamer offensively. But the good news is Spencer Rattler, he's confident right now, and he's playing as well as, like I mentioned, any quarterback in the SEC. But it's Mark. It's going to take South Carolina winning the turnover battle 3-0 or 4-0. Beamer ball will have to show itself in special teams, and I think Georgia probably would have to play their C- or D+ game, and South Carolina play their A+ game for the Gamecocks to win this one. So realistically, but I do think, Mark, with all that being said, can South Carolina at least show that they're making progress, right? Because I don't just think it's good enough to say, okay, well, Georgia's vastly superior to you. This should be another blowout. Kind of this series is turning into what I thought about the Clemson series going into last year, where it's like at some point you got to start giving these guys a more competitive game, because Mizzou did it last year. Kentucky plays Georgia tight every now and then. Like, why is South Carolina, is it good enough to just say, well, Georgia's better than us, we expect them to blow us out? I'm curious to see if this is the game that the Gamecocks can show they're making progress. But obviously, again, it's a tall task, and some things have definitely got to bounce their way to even, I think, Mark, make this a second half ball game in Athens.
Chris Phillips, it's the Spurs Up Show. You can catch it right here on YouTube each and every day, Monday through Friday, noon Eastern time. Chris takes your calls, and he talks college football with you noon to 3 p.m. Eastern time. And Chris, not to give you and the rest of Gamecock Nation little hope, but see, the issue I see here is everything that we talked about off the top. if this team looked sluggish against North Carolina and lost by 2 touchdowns and came out of the gate sluggish against Furman, where it was a 1-score game in the second quarter, and it was about, okay, Spencer and the receivers aren't on the same page. There's some misconnections there. They got to continue to work the reps, dropped passes, blown coverages in the secondary that need to be shored up, those sorts of things. But when the line of scrimmage play is the issue, you can only scheme around that so much. I don't know what you do when you're getting just beat up front on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, I think our good friend Jake Crane, Mark, made a really good point on our show on Friday when he said that, you look at the Colorado game plan and the way that they're using quick screens and bubble screens and the draw game and, the quick passing game, sort of an extended handoff, extension of the run. I think that's what South Carolina needs to do and will have to do. They're not going to be able to run the football, Mark. Let's just get it out there, right? I mean, South Carolina ran for 108 yards against Furman. And I know that they were throwing the football of the yard. I totally get that. But again, I just go back to 2.8 yards per carry. The UNC game, we've already talked about that. So also the defensive side, though, stopping the run. And I'm worried. I'm very, very worried about the Gamecocks' defensive front. They lost Mo Kaba after the UNC game, one of their top linebackers for the season. They're going to need a guy like Grayson Pup Howard, a true freshman, a very highly touted recruit, but a true freshman to step in there and play meaningful minutes. Also, you look at the secondary, Mark, Nick Eamon-Wari. He's questionable for this game. That's arguably their best defensive player. So, to your point, Mark, I mean, here's the thing, because coming out of the Furman game, for example, so many Gamecock fans looked at that and said, oh, let's just go air raid. Let's throw it every play, like abandon the run game, ditch the run game. And I'm even guilty of that, Mark, because it's so easy, right, to go on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, or go on social media and say, South Carolina should just ditch the run game. That is so much easier said than done in the SEC. Like, you can get away with that in other conferences, the Big 12, the Pac-12. But in the SEC, Mark, you know as well as I do, if you can't run the ball and you can't stop the run, and most importantly, you cannot protect your quarterback, it's just going to be really, really tough sledding for you, right? And so I look at South Carolina. How do they scheme around it? Because they've got the skill position players to go toe-to-toe with Georgia, and they've got the quarterback. Like South Carolina, they have the advantage at the quarterback position going into this game. When you have a quarterback, you have a chance. But will they be able to give him enough time? And Mark, just a semblance of just like the facade, I should say, of being balanced. That was my greatest concern coming in for this offense. When South Carolina lacks the ability to have any sort of balance, and they put the entire game on Spencer Rattler, and they're getting in second and longs and third and longs especially, you're almost giving Spencer Rattler no chance back there. So, Dowell Loggins, that was a name, the offensive coordinator, Mark, we were keeping a close eye on, sort of gauging what's his offense going to look like. Is he up to the challenge? Is he up to the task? We're going to learn a lot about him over these coming weeks with how do you scheme around the offensive line, because, Mark, again, you know as well as I do, offensive line issues be damned. This fan base is expecting to win and to compete in a game like Saturday.
Yeah, he's going to earn his paycheck against this Georgia defense. There's no question about it, because you can say abandon the run game, and I get it when you're running into a brick wall time and time again. It seems like, what are you doing? It's 2nd and 11. You're constantly behind the sticks. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make any sense. Put the game in your best hands, the hands of your best player, and let him fling it. But yes, if you're dropping back 7 steps, he's a sitting duck over and over and over, and those guys can just peel their ears back. Check out the Tennessee game against Georgia last year, and they just, they gave up 1 touchdown when it was meaningful minutes because they just peeled back. And they just crushed those Tennessee tackles and came after Hendon Hooker time and time again, and you just can't play football like that. Has to be a respect for run game, and something else. There just has to be, or it just doesn't work. Now, you can lean heavy pass. There's no doubt about that. That should be the game plan in some manner, and bring out every bell and whistle you can possibly find in the attic, because that's the kind of game plan you need in this one.
Well, and Mark, to your point, I was going to say, I think South Carolina's best bet truly is going with that Colorado type attack, or whatever you want to call it, and it's funny. This sounds blasphemous, because South Carolina just fired Marcus Satterfield, their old OC, last year, because way too many swing passes, way too many passes behind the line of scrimmage. But I actually think South Carolina, that's their best bet for generating or manufacturing some sort of running game. It just getting the football on the outside to your playmakers and asking your wide receivers, your tight ends, what have you, to go out there and throw some blocks. Because, again, Mark, I just don't see the Gamecocks having success in the trenches running the football. Like this is not all of a sudden the game where Carolina is going to find that rushing attack. So I think you're going to have to be really, really creative with it. I think if you can work the outsides a little bit, maybe every now and then you pop one in the middle, because like you mentioned, Mark, you've got to find a way to get to 2nd and 5, right? 2nd and 6, 2nd and manageable, right? Because then it opens up the playbook for you. But if you're in 2nd and 11, then you're getting in 3rd and 8. I mean, Georgia's defense are just too good, man. And you look back at the Furman game, South Carolina had a lot of success, going to the deep ball to Xavier Legette and throwing the ball up. And, a lot of those 50-50 balls that they had in the Furman game that they completed, those are not going to be completions against the Georgia secondary and against the Georgia defense. Spencer Rattler, Mark, although the Gamecocks offensive line gave up no sacks, I mean, the heat was coming from Furman. Like, there were definitely times where he was hit as he threw. He had to scramble. So I am fearful of what this Georgia defensive front will do. And again, like I said, getting the football to the outside, getting it to your playmakers, letting them work. It's going to take a masterful game plan for South Carolina to have some significant offensive success.
Has what you've seen in the first 2 games changed your mind about South Carolina football this year and what you expect?
Not drastically, Mark, because I still go back to South Carolina under Shane Beamer has such a knack for improving from week 1 to week 13, right? So I see the pieces. Mark, admittedly, this football team has the question marks that I thought they had. Now, it's maybe brought more into focus that I did not think 5-7. I don't want to say I didn't think it was possible, but I didn't think it was likely. 5-7 could absolutely happen. Like, if they don't improve up front, if they don't take some steps as the season goes, 5-7 is absolutely in the picture. Because I look, even Mississippi State's line of scrimmage, that could give them issues. Tennessee, we see what they're doing. Even Florida, Mark, Florida can run the football, right? I know they didn't look great against Utah, but there's a lot of middle-of-the-pack SEC teams. South Carolina would have lost to Utah. Like, there's no question. Missouri's going to give you issues in the line of scrimmage. Texas A&M, I know we all fell victim to drinking their Kool-Aid again, but they've got dudes in the trenches all of a sudden. Like, I know Clemson doesn't look great, but that'll be a challenge in the test late season. But I picked 7-5, Mark, over the summer. I'm not one to really change the predictions as we go because, like I said, Mark, you look at last year. I mean, Carolina, this is a program, this is a team. You lose to Florida 38-6, and beyond all comprehension, you go beat Tennessee and Clemson. So I think it'd be foolish right now after just 2 games of play to mail it in and say the Gamecocks are doomed for a 4-8 and 5-7 season. I think 8 wins is sort of out of the picture for me, which I thought that was the best case scenario anyway. So I'm still sticking with 7-5, not looking too far ahead, Mark. The game, Mississippi State's a huge game, right? Because I felt like over the summer, I had South Carolina beating UNC, but losing to Mississippi State, right, in an upset. I never thought the Gamecocks would lose both of those games. I thought they would split them. If you lose to Mississippi State, assuming that this Saturday goes as we expect, Georgia gets the dub, if you lose to Mississippi State, Mark, I think that's where 5-7 really comes into play for this football team, which would be a disaster, right? Nothing short of it in year 3 of Shane Beamer. So, I think they need a youth movement up front. They've got some really talented 5- and 4-star guys that they brought in that are true freshmen that, maybe aren't ready to play SEC football, but it's a lot better than watching the same 5 guys get whipped in the line of scrimmage, which I think is going to happen if they keep those guys out there. I think they've just got some dudes that aren't built for the SEC, and I think for South Carolina for the long run, it'd be much smarter to go with those young guys, let them take their licks early, so at least, Mark, at minimum, come second half of the season, those guys, they've been in the fire, baptism by fire, if you will, and they're ready to make a big impact. So to answer your question, though, Mark, short form, no, it hasn't changed my thoughts drastically, but as SEC play gets going, I think that's going to tell us a lot as well, and we're going to learn a lot about this Gamecocks football team over the coming weeks.
Mississippi State barely squeaked by Arizona in overtime at home on a measurement on a 4th down play. So I was expecting the Bulldogs to turn in a better effort than that as a 9-point favorite. So maybe there's some optimism there that a couple struggling teams may meet in Starkville in South Carolina and can
Night
pull out a
game,
win on the road.
night game at Williams Brice as well for that
Oh,
ball game. So I
gotcha.
think, yeah, it's at South Carolina. And it was announced today, Monday, 7:30 p.m. kick. And we know, Mark, you know, we all know South Carolina has been a different football team at night under Shane Beamer. So I think the fact they got that game at night is massive for South Carolina's chances.
When you look at these two teams, and more so the two environments, the campuses, the schools, the fan bases, and everything, I know South Carolina gets up for this one. Well, of course, everybody gets up for somebody the status of Georgia. But how does Georgia view South Carolina? Are they just another SEC Eastern Division foe, or of course it's a neighboring state?
Yeah. I mean, Georgia's going to be up for South Carolina. I mean, Coach Smart, I think the way they practice, they go about business. I don't think there's going to be any kind of question, about that. And it's kind of funny. I mean, one of the big storylines, if you want to call it, one of their players back during media day was asked about the most hostile environments in the SEC, and he didn't mention Georgia. And somebody asked Coach Smart about that, and of course, Coach Smart's going to play it up and say, "Well, I guess he's calling out our fans." When actually he wasn't, but still, Coach Smart is going to look for any kind of edge he can get, and so I suspect, him bringing that to everybody's attention. You'll see Georgia's fan base pretty loud, I think, come Saturday afternoon.